shaking all over. Bum, 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 bum.
Lama Glenn, thank you very much for joining us today for an interview. And yeah, so we got to know you recently, and you lived for 12 years in the Himalayas. You learned from many of the great teachers from Tibet, teachers who were also the teachers of the Dalai Lama, from the Gelugpa school, but also from other schools like Kalu Rinpoche, Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. And you wrote more than 20 books, many of them about the early Dalai Lamas, also 2 books about the 6 Yogas of Naropa, about the practice of Kala Chakra. And from one of your books, we also got the information that you have 7 children. And all in all, one could say you are a man with an incredible life experience. And our first question would be, how did it came that you become a Buddhist? How did your journey start? Yeah.
You know, I think everyone's life has many dimensions and facets to it. In my own case, I was born on a little village on the east coast of Canada, far from Tibet, India, Dalai Lamas, all of that whole circle of wisdom and knowledge. I was born in a kind of a, what would you say, Christian Protestant Anglican Church of England. I sang in the choir as a young kid, and then as an altar boy as a teenager. And because my mom volunteered my brother and I to do that, we did not volunteer. But I'm glad we did. The singing in the choir was a good musical experience, and I think much of the, Christ, if we look at him in one way, was a kind of a closet Buddhist, we could say. You know, when I was 18 or 17, I read a book called The Secret Life of Christ, where at age 12, after being in the temple, he has to flee being stoned to death for beating the rabbis in a debate in the temple, which in those days, winning could be a problem. So escaped and went to India for 16 years and then reappears at age 28. And so, but except for that Christian upbringing, I didn't have a strong connection directly. But on the good side, my mom was a British war bride, and her dad had been a major in the British Army in India at the turn of the last century. And all the Brits, and he was all of the officers in the British Army in those days were all from kind of educated families, usually second sons. The first had to stay home and take over the family estate or family business, and the second should join the army and serve king and country, or in those days, queen and country, Queen Victoria at times. And they all fell in love with India, basically, and with the Himalayas, and then with Tibet. My mom, because of that, had lots of books on Asian culture in her house, and Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, and from China, the Tao Te Ching, and from Persia, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam and Kabir, and all of these sort of great classics of Asia. She had belonged to something called the Theosophical Society, which was a Russian-based sort of all spiritual traditions should be, from Blavatsky. Yeah, all spiritual traditions should be explored, and their truth is not the domain of any one tradition. So she had, because of that, even though she was strongly Church of England, but not in a sectarian or a negative sectarian way. And she would often at dinner, if my dad wasn't home, if he was at work, pull out Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam or Upanishads and sort of read a favorite verse, Bhagavad Gita, something like that. So because of that, I sort of fell in love with the Asian wisdom tradition. And after college, I went to England to meet my mother's side of the family, because she was being British war bride. And while there, I heard the Dalai Lama was opening a school for Western people. I didn't hear that it was at the Tibetan Library, but it was in the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, which we all later just called Tibetan Library, and appointed two teachers, two great lamas, to teach to us foreigners who visited. I think, you know, through the backpack travel route to India in those days, he was getting like 100 people a week showing up in Dharamsala, and he was giving two public audiences every week, Monday and Friday. And all these people are requesting to study this and study that. So then he thought, well, we better formalize this. Also in 1963, 9 years before I went to India, he had given a talk in Sarnath in which he said to a large group of assembled lamas and monks that the Lankavatara Sutra states that 2,500 years after my death, my Dharma will go to the land of the red man. And of course, that means Irish, because when the Irish drink or get angry, so anyway, so he mentioned this prophecy in that 1963 talk to an assembly of a couple of thousand lamas, like many of the lamas who had escaped as refugees into India only 4 years earlier in 1959, 1960. And he said to them, well, you better start studying English and other foreign languages because you're going to have a big service internationally in the next decades, fulfilling that prophecy. So he was well aware of it, and I think he opened the school for that purpose. And I heard of it when I was in Europe, and so went to Dharamsala to join it in 1972. Originally thought I'd stay for 3 years and would be fully enlightened, but after 3 years, I was almost. A little more. So it became 6, and then 9, and then 12. And I would have stayed continually longer, but I had to go back to Canada for some paperwork temporarily, and I was only planning to be gone a month or 6 weeks. But when I was out of the country, Mrs. Indira Gandhi was assassinated. And because her assassination was sponsored and planned by Indians living in Canada, the Indian government got a little irritated at us. And they asked us to hand those Indians over to them, but we couldn't because Canada, firstly, they're Canadian citizens, so we can't deport a Canadian to any country with whom we don't have an extradition treaty. And if someone requests it, they have to present the evidence in a Canadian court. We just can't take their word for it. And of course, the reason why the Indians knew that it was sponsored by Canadian Sikhs, the Indians in Canada, is they had been spying on Canadians, Indians living in Canada. These were Indians born in Canada. It's like they'd been here, you know, since the 1880s, those guys, 1890s. They immigrated way back when and during the British rule time, you know, so. But so as a result, I couldn't go back to India. So for a while, it took about a year to sort out that situation. So rather than be gone for 6 weeks, I was gone for about a year. And after that, I continued going back for 3, 4, 5, 6 months a year to do retreats or attend Dalai Lama teachings. From my side, yeah, it was really a great, great blessing, if I could use that word in a kind of a general sense of Irish good luck. Very lucky, or a little bit like Shantideva in Bodhicharyavatara, like a flash of lightning illuminates everything. That rare is the possibility of enlightenment. It was very fortunate that I sort of just connected in that way. when I arrived in Dharamsala, many of the great lamas to come out of Tibet were still alive. Ling Rinpoche, Dalai senior tutor, and Trijang Rinpoche. And they treated us pretty well, like we were their family. I mean, it's not like they looked upon us as weirdos from a weird country. You know, and a lot of people do, you know. I mean, if you, like for instance, Chinese Buddhism would have spread a lot faster in the West, except Chinese tend to be quite racist in their attitudes, even the Buddhist teachers. And so they won't teach for many decades. Now they do a little bit, but for many decades, Chinese Buddhism had been over here, but for a white guy to walk in and get any serious instruction was pretty tough.
Yeah.
And so I think Japanese Zen was the first kind of to make any inroads over here, but that was after World War II. And before that, they wouldn't do anything, but you know, we dropped a couple of nukes on them and they started respecting us a little bit more.
And fast forwarding into nowadays, like when it comes to Six Yogas of Naropa, they get increasingly more attention in the West, right? You wrote 2 books about them. Can you tell us a little bit more about them?
Well, of all of the Tantric, you know, all schools of Tibetan Buddhism, I should say, are a combination of sutra teaching, what they like to call triyana, 3 vehicles, Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana. Hinayana there meaning basic Buddhism, such as 3 higher trainings and 12 links of dependent origination, the 4 noble truths, cause and effect, karma, basic meditation. Then Mahayana, which is the Bodhisattva path of achieving enlightenment by means of 6 paramita quickly to benefit all living beings. And then Vajrayana. And so sometimes these are divided into 2, Sutra and Tantra. So Sutra, we can say, is the causal path. We think I'm not enlightened. I'd like to cultivate the causes of enlightenment and become enlightened. And so it's Sutra, both in Hinayana, Mahayana aspects or levels of training are causal like that. We try to cultivate the causes of enlightenment. But Tantra is called the result vehicle. Rather than cultivate the causes of enlightenment, we say, oh, fudge it. I'm just going to skip directly to enlightenment and identify with enlightened mind. It's sort of a yoga. So often the Tibetan name is Lagi Nyalchor, deity yoga or Buddha yoga. It's kind of a special method of connecting with an aspect of our mind which is in synchronicity with enlightenment, you could say. Something perhaps already enlightened in a way, but that's kind of a loaded term and is not liked much by Galupas and Sakyapas and some Kargyupas. But it is really quite appropriate. There's an aspect of our mind which is already enlightened. So the yoga of connecting with that. And on that, there's, as you know, there's 2 levels, the sort of mantra, mandala practice and the sadhana practice, the visualization of oneself as a Buddha form and a meditation on that mandala, the world as a paradise and so on. But then the inner yoga, which is completion stage, which really comes down to Chandali, or Hindus mispronounce that as Kundalini. They steal everything from us, those Hindus, and mispronounce it all to boot. Adding insult to injury. First they steal it, then they mispronounce it.
Just to avoid the trademark.
Yes, yeah. It's like when you're in Thailand, you can buy Levi jeans, but they can't say Levi, they'll say Levi's or Loves.
Yeah.
But they'll make it look exactly the same except for one little letter. So anyway, based on Tummo. So every highest yoga tantra has a system of Tummo or Chandali yoga, Kundalini yoga. Well, the 6 yogas is unique in that it simplifies the process and combines important elements from a half dozen different tantras. And because of that simplicity, I think, and the way it fuses different tantric lineages, it's achieved considerable popularity. And in Tibet, it was practiced by all schools, although it was brought to Tibet by Marpa Lotsoa and transmitted through Milarepa Gampopa, then through the 4 early Kagyu schools and 8 25-year later schools. Sometimes they're called the 4 greater schools and the 8 lesser schools, but that's sort of a silly name. The 4, what would it be, 900-year-old schools and 4 875-year-old schools. In fact, one of the so-called lesser schools, Drikung Kagyu, was as big as all other Kagyu schools combined. But from them, it spread to all the other schools. And Gelugpa Tsongkhapa, when he first established Ganden, actually his main patron was a Pama Trukpa king. And Pama Trukpa, that means Drikung Kagyu. So it was thought he was probably, it was kind of like an offshoot of the Drikung school, was people's thinking. So in Gelugpa, our lineage of 6 yogas of Naropa comes from Drikung. The difference between Gelugpa and the other schools is the other schools all have lineages directly tracing to India. In other words, 1 or 2 Indian masters were the source of those schools. Like with Marpa studying with 4 great masters, Naropa, Maitripa, and so forth, or Droklok Sawa studying with Virupa and various other teachers forming the Sakyapas, and Atisha coming to Tibet and being the source of Kadampa, and Ralotswa school, Padampa Senghi school, and so forth. So most have one main lineage coming from India, and supplemented by other lineages. The difference was Gelugpa Tsongkhapa traveled and studied with 50 or 55 different teachers of all the different schools and combined what he thought was the best of those lineages. 6 yogas, he chose Pama Trukpa school because Milarepa gave main responsibility to Gampopa. And when Gampopa was old, he gave his hat to Pama Trukpa. When Pama Trukpa was old, he gave his hat to Drikung Chungan. So those hats of knowledge was a little bit like with Zen masters in China would give their staff or their begging bowl to their main student. In Tibetan, they give their hat. So for Tsongkhapa, the Pama Trukpa Drikung Kagyu stream was the strongest. And so mainly, he studied many different lineages of 6 yogas, but he mainly looked to them as the authoritative interpretation of all those practices. I think the first translation of that was made, of 6 yogas, was made back in the 1920s by Lama Dawa Kazi Sendop. And after he died, his manuscripts came to the American writer-editor, Evans Wentz. And Kazi Sendop had translated Pema Karpo commentary, I think it was, Great Trukpa Kagyu Lama, his brief commentary to 6 yogas. So that was the first one in English. And later he did another, again, but in Tibetan it's known as a migrim, a simple practice text. Cliff notes on the practice, you could say, meant for teachers guiding students to get the key points right. And a translation of Tsongkhapa's came out by some Chinese monk called Garma Sisi Chang, who really disliked Tsongkhapa, and his whole book was just sort of translation. He was just hired to translate about a dozen manuscripts that some Texas professor had picked up in India. That was one of them. And he made a rough translation of it, but then he and the professor had a big fight and disappeared. And so the professor didn't know much about Buddhism, and it was an unfinished thing. and also unfinished draft. And then Garmasisi Chang really had a deep dislike for Gelugpa. So his footnotes were all kind of, lambasting Tsongkhapa for things he didn't like about him. So then I thought, well, I should do a sympathetic translation and finish it, not actually just get a rough draft and then die, and some guy who doesn't know anything about it will edit it into final form. So that's why I did my book on it. And I use Tsongkhapa's what's called Yiche Sumden, Book of Three Inspirations, because he goes through 20 or 30 of the main surviving lineages of six yogas and points out which element of which one he thinks is the strongest or clearest or most authentic, based on the transmission from Marpa to Milarepa to Gampopa to Pamatrukpa. So a very important text in Tibetan history in that it really fuses all of the schools into one. Tsongkhapa, you could say, was the first true Rimé Tibetan master, non-sectarian Tibetan master. Otherwise, in Tibet, all of the different Kagyu lineages had almost no exchange with each other from the time they founded. Every monastery had its own lineages, its own lineage lamas. Lamas from other Kagyu schools wouldn't come and teach in a different Kagyu school. A Drikung teacher wouldn't teach in a Karma Kagyu school. A Drukpa wouldn't teach in a Karma, in a I don't know, Salpa school or like that. Largely because Tibet was so huge and they maintained practice traditions that became very insular. So Tsongkhapa's was really the first, you could say, multi-lineage analysis of the tradition. And on top of that, he wrote a Migrim, which is like an easy practice manual. When I was working on that, I figured, all these different lineages in Tibet, coming from India, they developed something of a unique linguistic, and then in Tibet, because these lineages sort of grew in different parts of the country, they developed somewhat unique language. So every lineage of Tantra, because of where it went and how it developed, has something of its own idiosyncratic approach to communication. And so I read maybe a dozen different commentaries at that time just to come to grips with how those words were being used. So after I published my Tsongkhapa's big text or great text on it, I thought it'd be nice to throw a half dozen of those together as general reading, like the very short text from Tilopa and a slightly longer text from Naropa, and then in Tibet, a half a dozen Tibetan commentaries on various aspects. So I did those two. The Six Yogas isn't taught very much in the West, except in a 3-year retreat or a 4-year retreat setting. And there seems to be some recalcitrance amongst Tibetan lamas to teach it in a more general way.
Yeah, and that's why we have this interview with you now.
Yeah, actually, when attending your last teachings on Tummo, we were also surprised because you have a quite revolutionary approach from what we used to hear about Tibetan Buddhist teachers often, that they say it's dangerous or it's only possible in a retreat. And you actually said something that you think it is most appropriate for Westerners.
I think it's an ideal outline practice, skeletal practice for Western Buddhists. Now, the problem I have with Tibetan Buddhism as a refugee culture is that it's become very sectarian. Mm-hmm. And it's designed that way. So for instance, to do the many tantric practices, the big emphasis becomes gundro, preliminaries. Well, the preliminaries, the way they're taught for the last 100 years or so, really are designed to get a practitioner linked pretty well exclusively to that one school. So if you do Nyingma, you'll probably do the Nyingtik preliminaries, which means the long prostrations to the Nyingma lineage. Or if it's Karmapa's Karma Kagyu, Karma Kamsen, it'll be Karmapa, and you'll chant Karmapa Keno, Karmapa knows a bunch of times, and then you'll become Karma Kargyu. Or if it's Drikung, you'll have the Drikung lineage, or Sakya, you'll have the Sakya lineage. And I'm not too fond of that. I can see why Tibetans did that for the last 100 years of being in Tibet, but I can also see how it was one of the reasons Tibet fell to the Chinese, that kind of isolation and sort of sense of, well, just the isolation created by having 100 little schools, none of which especially have anything to do with the others. Developed a political and social problem, I think. Yeah. Less in Tibet, but then when they came into exile in India, it became more serious, because then you had refugees living in India with no support base, and mostly one or two lamas from each school having the responsibility of rebuilding that school in exile, while back at home, 6,500 monasteries, temples, and libraries were all razed to the ground. Only 13 weren't totally destroyed, but they were closed and their treasures carried off and were converted to warehouses or military barracks. So you can see how Tibetans in India became preserve my sect, preserve my school, preserve my lineages, preserve my son. And for me, I mean, that's good that they do that in some ways, and I'm sure in the long run it'll have something useful. But for me, as a white guy, to me, it's not that interesting. I'm happy, of course, to help whoever I can help and to preserve whatever I can help. But what's more interesting for me is for me to become an enlightened being. Because in Mahayana Buddhism, we say every day, may I quickly become an enlightened being, so I'll be of more use to all living beings, greater benefit to all beings. And does that sort of connect to my sect and be part of my sect for the rest of your life and dedicate your whole life to the preservation of unpreservation and expansion of our lineages? So that's good for some people, I think, but not for us Irish. I don't think we're much too eclectic for that. And so for me, of course, Gelugpa is my favorite school in the sense that it's where I first studied, and I met Dalai Lama, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, and I had that very deep connection with them. And they've always felt very, very much like I'm part of that family. But, when I had opportunity to meet and receive lineages from previous Kala Rinpoche, I was very delighted to do so. And Sakya Trijang, I was very delighted to do so. And Dalai Lama and Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche always promoted amongst us this kind of study from every Lama you can study from, receive whatever blessings from different schools. And don't think, I'm Gelugpa, or I'm this or I'm that, but think of yourself as someone who has taken the Bodhisattva way to practice love and compassion for all living beings as much as you can, as a descendant of a barbarian king of Connaught. There is always that little barbarian in all of us where love and compassion sometimes stretches a little thin in certain situations. But I think that Bodhisattva idea that the more enlightened I am, the better I am for myself and the better I am for others. That's they emphasize that very much. And in Gelugpa, of course, every Tantra comes from a different school. Tsongkhapa didn't go to India. So our 6 Yogas of Naropa comes from the Dakpo Kargyu, and our 6 Yogas of Niguma comes from the Shengpa. And our Narokachidma version of Vajrayogini comes from Sakya. And our Chakra Samvara 5 deity practice comes from the Shalu school. And our Chud comes from the Shiche school, and so on. So Gelugpa sort of had that Rime approach from the beginning. And in India, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, Dalai Lama, those 3 guys who, they ran the show for Dalai Lama school in India. I mean, Dalai Lama was kind of low-key, in those early days, because his two gurus, Ling Rinpoche, Trijang Rinpoche, were still dominant figures. But for them, that was very, very important. And I think my very first teaching was connected to the Tummo practice, just by chance. And so it made that strong feeling there. And the next year, Gebje Trijang Dorje Chang gave a Vajrayogini initiation, which he stated would probably be his last in his life because he was getting quite old. And teaching now followed by Six Yogas of Naropa. And we were allowed to listen into that, you could say, or sit at the back very quietly and try not to fart, burp, or fall asleep.
Like proper barbarians.
I like the way Lama Zopa put it, because he was giving a teaching once on, I received Yamantaka initiation, I think it was maybe January 1973, and we're half a dozen foreigners had been allowed to attend, and I was one of them. And Ling Rinpoche asked him to teach the basic practice. And during the teaching, one of the guys let out this big fart.
Oh, wow.
and at the end of it, Rinpoche, so at the end of the teaching, said, oh, so tomorrow we go in for another session with Gebje Ling Rinpoche, and this thing of, it's okay to do in front of me, but don't do in front of Gebje Rinpoche, please. Of course, in India, it's not easy not to, right? You get so many rice and dal, and the lentils in India are often not as well cooked as they should be if they're not going to give stomach gases. So you need to have strong control over the oblong, the downward descending. But strangely, the other 5 people at that teaching all went on to become very strong Buddhist translators and also teachers and writers. And the one who had let the fart, he dropped out of Buddhism a year later and just sort of disappeared and became I think a fund manager or something like that. So maybe it was an omen, fart in front of Gebje Ling Dorje Chang, and you could end up working on Wall Street.
That's karma.
Yeah. But I mean, Six Yogas of Naropa, for me, Tummo and all of its sources are very useful. But what's especially good about Six Yogas of Naropa, Six Yogas of Neguma, is the way they combine the principal points of female tantras like Chakrasambhara and male tantras like Guhya Samaja, and do so in a very well organized, easy to approach way. So when I started teaching, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, kind of started by accident because I had about, I don't know, 15 or 20 books out, maybe 25 at that time. And publishers are always, pressing you to travel and give readings and lectures and get you in radio shows and newspapers to sell more of the books. Of course, we get a royalty, so we're also okay with that. But as it went on, then people started asking me also to do like weekend workshops and meditation sessions and stuff like that. So it sort of developed sort of gradually like that. And then at the beginning, I would mainly teach like Lojong and Lamrem and sort of the Bodhisattva path, a little bit of Tantra like Tara, stuff like that. But then I noticed in my own life, the most beneficial for me was Six Yogas of Naropa. And so I started teaching Tummo from the Six Yogas of Naropa and then some of the connected other yogas. It sort of became, and then people seemed to really respond very well to it. But of course, some conservative lamas still criticize it a little bit to do that because it's just not the way they do it. Whereas I think one should always teach what was most beneficial to oneself.
Yes, exactly. So why it's so beneficial to you? What type of benefits did you notice, and why it would be so as much beneficial for modern people from the Western culture?
Well, for one thing, one very powerful aspect of Six Yogas of Naropa, being based on Tantra, is it tends to use every situation as a practice situation. The use of the objects of the senses. Tantra is often called Dulam, the path of desire. And actually, Dulam is short for Du-yulgi Lam, the path in which sensual objects are used as objects of meditation. So these are called sensual objects because they often, like Lama Yeshe used to put it, if you eat chocolate, you can easily get addicted to chocolate. And if you anything that good, you can easily become addicted to it. So in some Indian traditions, cutting that attachment, or cutting desire, cutting sense, is achieved by reducing sensual objects. Like Hinayana monks, for instance, the monk training, they're supposed to walk with eyes down, not looking too much. And if they see something, think, oh, just a sensation. In other words, it's a visual sensation. They hear some good music. Da, 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 da. They go, audio sensation. A beautiful lady comes up and says, oh, what a nice hair you have. And she gives you a little kiss on the cheek, and they go, tactile sensation. But Vajrayogini, great Indian mystic, who, she's called Vajrayogini because she practiced Vajrayogini Tantra, once put it, you cannot get through desire by avoiding objects of desire. Therefore, all schools of Tibetan Buddhism unanimously state that it takes 3 eons of many lifetimes to achieve enlightenment in the sutra way without using objects of desire. It's very difficult to go very far. Like, for instance, just the other day, I was sitting with a friend who mentioned that when she went to India, her Lama, who's Karmakargyu, organized for one of his monk followers to meet her and her 2 traveling companions and take them to a hotel. And first he put them in, but then when she put her in her room, he sort of strokes her face like that and then looks at her with great passion and strokes her breasts a couple of times. It's very difficult to get over desire by avoiding desire. It's like having an itch and not scratching it. It can just become itchier. Now, there can be times when cutting objects of desire, objects of sensual indulgence, are useful as a mind training, but as a long-term thing, that's always going to be there.
Yeah.
I remember when I was translating a book on the trainings of a novice monk, it was a commentary by Lama Mipam, great Nyingma Lama. And that's the root text is by Nagarjuna, great Indian master. Mipam tells a story of a monk who went into a long retreat and thought he had achieved arhatship and become a saint. And he walked down to town, and the sight of beautiful ladies in town, immediately his penis went doink. So it's very difficult with ordinary means to transcend attachment or immediate uncontrolled response to sensual objects, like with that monk in the time of Buddha, or with that monk who, was given the responsibility of meeting these 3 people and seeing them safely to their hotel, and he sort of just swoons at the beauty of this lady and can't help himself but stroke her. And so Tantra, I think, is very useful in that on the first level of practice, we learn to master the yoga of the 5 Buddha families. In other words, how to be angry without throwing our attention on the object of the anger. How to just let the anger rise and flow, and sit quietly and watch it and draw energy from that flow rather than just be carried by that flow and thrown into a fit of rage and become violent or cruel or whatever, or fearful if we go the other way or whatever. And the same with desire, and the same with, pride or arrogance or whatever you want to call it, and the same with jealousy, and the same with laziness.
And how it is different from Mahamudra then?
Well, Mahamudra is a general word. So Tantra has its very specific practice, which is by means of Lineage or deity yoga. In other words, our sadhana training and our mantra training. Whereas Mahamudra, you could say, is a kind of a bigger picture toward inner mental posturing.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Tantra is more very precise technology,
Mm-hmm.
dealing with each situation with utter precision.
Mm-hmm.
So on the generation stage like that, learning to connect with the radiance and energy and sort of the pleasure, like when you're angry, there's a kind of pleasure in anger. You know, it's kind of your adrenaline it's kind of an adrenaline rush, isn't it? And you get this kind of adrenaline rush. And with desire, whether it's desire for a food, just the thought of that good food, or a desire for a drug, the thought of that drug, desire for a beautiful woman, just the thought of that woman, you go, ah. And it's so how to use that, and we get jealous. Everyone gets jealous over this and that, Bill Gates has 100 billion, and I'd like a two of those, So how do we feel that kind of jealousy? Often in the West, we use jealousy more in a kind of a romantic situation, but it really goes towards everything, doesn't it? And pride or arrogance. How do we feel superior to others and totally great, while at the same time not belittling others? It's a kind of a yoga, you could say. And there's kind of an energy in pride, we'd feel, wow, I'm great. I feel great today. There's a kind of a freedom in that, isn't it? There's kind of a joy in that. There's a kind of an energy or a power in that. But how do we use that power in a bodhisattva way, you could say, in an all-embracing way? So it's not just us, but we embrace others with it. Yeah. So in the generation stage, we say, do so, see yourself as a Buddha, but also see all others as emanations of Buddhas, bodhisattvas, dakus, and dakinis. So try to see that same greatness in all beings, regardless of how they're manifesting. Manifesting is a temporary contextualization, like a plant growing around a rock. It has to take those twists and turns to get around those rocks. Then on the completion stage, if we say 6 yogas of Naropa, we should understand 6 yogas is, as I point out in both my books, often better known in the old world, old days, as 10 dharmas of Naropa, because Hinayana, Mahayana as sutra preliminaries and tantra preliminaries and generation stage. Yoga of highest yoga, tantra being, what is that, 2 of the 4, and then they take the 6 and they divide Tummo into Tummo and then Karmamudra, or we could say soulmate practice. We could call it sex yoga, but soulmate The Tibetan word Karmamudra means a consort with whom one has a deep karma, deep destiny. So actually it kind of works a little bit like soulmate, you could say, in a general way, although the Greek idea of soulmate was kind of crazy in the beginning. Glenn was just one, and then somebody ripped him apart and threw the female part over there and the male part over there, and the two have been wandering around. And these are the 300 million women I've made love to over the last 200 million lifetimes. It's just been looking for that other. Eventually I'll get lucky, but it's not arriving at your destination, which is the great success. It's the pleasure of the journey. So Karmamudra as soulmate, the idea there is our sexual energy is in a way our most sacred quality. And this is very different than in a sutra way of teaching where your sexual energy is kind of dangerous. And it is kind of dangerous. I mean, if you watch murder mysteries, there's often said the three great causes of murder is money, sex, revenge. Money, sex, revenge. These three are the three main causes of murder. So being one of the three is already quite big. That means, and I don't know if those three are like equal, like 1/3 of them with each one. Is probably like the sex thing probably dominates. Yeah. Probably like 1/2 or 2/3 come over romantic irritation, you could say. Some guy looking at another guy and saying, we both like the same girl and this world isn't big enough for both of us at this particular point in history. I would go, but I'd sooner stay, so sorry about that. So sexual energy has that very, very deep sort of power over us. So like the kleshas, if we don't learn to utilize that, we will always be under its power. Either we learn to gain power over it or it takes power over us. And I think that aspect of Tantra, Freud kind of opened the door to Western society to understand Tantra in that way. As he puts it, our two deepest instincts are sex and death. Now, many people think he stole this idea from Buddhism, because Buddha in the Abhidharma teaching says when we're traveling in the bardo looking for our next reincarnation, we come down to the end result and we're about to look for a reincarnation and we're looking around the world for the perfect womb, a womb with a view. And we see a couple we see many couples making love. We kind of check them out. Oh, this one, no, that doesn't make it. That one's too big a nose. That one, not enough funny. That has too many good points in it. I would just become lazy and I'd be like a trust fund baby, just wasting my whole life. Like D.H. Lawrence puts it, walking on dead man's legs, living by my inheritance. Find the right degree of hardship and challenge with freedom and opportunity, the right degree that will fit us best. And we look and we find that room with a view and we look at the couple making love. And if we're to be born as a male, we'll get sexually very attracted to the female. If we're to be born as a female, sexually very attracted to the male. And that'll start, and then we'll notice, who's this other one there making love to this person that I have this strong? Then we'll think, oh, I'll have to kill that person to get in that womb. And so then our anger becomes so great and our sense of violence so great that it kills our body, our bardo body just breaks down. It's like a firecracker going off or a stick of dynamite pop and we're out of the bardo. So our last moment in the bardo before we enter the womb is this great sexual passion with this great sense of kill, kill, kill. So those are our two deepest instincts. So Freud is quite right there, but many people say he borrowed that from Buddhism because, you know, being a Germanic origin language-wise, he could read Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, sort of brought Buddhist philosophy into European philosophy, sort of blended it in and brought over a lot of those ideas. So I think I think that aspect of Tantra is very important, how we have those very deep instincts of kill, 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 fuck, 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 kill, no, kill, kill, no. And, you know, I forget, you know, sex studies show that, you know, your average male, the thought of sex goes through his mind is something like every 3 to 4 seconds.
Something like that.
So quickly, he hardly noticed. Ladies are a little more tame. It's only 7 or 8 seconds. They're more selective, you could say. So how to control that power without actually coming to understand it on a deep level? And that's what Tummo is about, really. It's about how to notice those very male, and so we say male tantra is based on this kill, kill, kill instinct, and the female tantra is this procreate, procreate, procreate sort of thing. And so, of course, we're both half male and half female, so we've got both to fairly similar degrees. So maybe one will emphasize a little bit more than the other at any given time, but they're both there in every living being. And so the sexual yoga, or Karmamudra in Tummo, you could say, is used to get back to that very primordial state of mind, which is similar to a one-cell being. In other words, at the moment of conception, when we enter the womb, and we enter the drop of sperm and ovum, at that time, we're just a single cell being. And so the sexual yoga is really intended to sort of get us back to that state in a very controlled way. And so it's always practiced in connection with clear light yoga, which is the basis of Mahamudra in Tantra, illusory body yoga, which is the basis of the bliss generated in Mahamudra practice. And then at the time of sleep, we naturally experience a kind of a breakdown, a melting of the coarse energies, and experience the clear light of moment of sleep. So at that time, again, we make a transition to that orgasmic state, you could say. And at the time of death, the clear light of the moment before death is again a kind of a mini orgasmic state. And so Tummo, without sexual yoga, all Tantra's state, we can't achieve enlightenment in one lifetime without sexual yoga unless we have achieved it in a previous life. So in my case, I'm very lucky I achieved it in a previous life, so I don't have to go with all that greasy, gooey, sticky, smelly stuff. I can just sit there at perfume looking at the flowers, roses. So for people who have accomplished that practice in a previous life, you can do just by the power of the male-femaleness of your own body, bringing the white drop down from the crown to the heart, the male drop from the crown chakra, the middle of the brain chakra, and the red drop from the navel chakra, bringing to the heart, bringing them together at the heart and holding them there, and entering the deep, clear light, illusory body yoga. But to do that, we must be able to get the energies into the central channel, and we must be able to gain control over the 72,000 male and female drops. And unless we have done that in a previous life, then the only way we can do it in this life is through sexual yoga. Now, sexual yoga in the West sounds a little kind of exotic or frivolous or something like that, but it's kind of silly that this is the situation. Because in reality, you know, birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it. An old Cole Porter song from the, I think, 1950s or 1960s. Yeah. Great songwriter, very, very mischievous. When he got a job with the movies, they said, writing music for film scripts, they said, please, could you don't write such clever stuff. It's just too clever. But, you know, most human beings, unless you become a monk or a nun or you're extremely unlucky, you'll make love many, many, many times in your lifetime. I mean, people start dating in their teens, and many people get married in their 20s or 30s. And, you know, even if you don't in your teens have full-fledged sex, although, I don't know, when one of my daughters was 15 years old, she phoned me up and said, "Dad, there's 30 people in my class and I'm the only one who hasn't had sex. Do you think that's a good idea?" Because she's an extremely beautiful woman. She said, "Do you think I should hold out for my eventual husband?" I won't give away the secret answer I gave to her.
I wanted to ask.
But the reality is, humans, usually back in India, starting from age 12 or 13, would start making love. And then actually in France and Quebec, still when I was born, French girls could get married at age 12 following old French law, because as soon as you can menstruate, you can produce babies. And so, and it's also proven, by the way, that girls who have delivered a child in their teen years, their chances of breast cancer are like 75% down, almost nil. So one of the biggest ways, if I ever become a dictator, world dictator, I'll make a rule that every girl at age 14 or 15 has to produce one baby as a prevention to breast cancer. She doesn't have to raise it. We'll figure some other kind of, you know, structure. What Hillary Clinton called, what was it? Sometimes a village.
Yeah.
Marshall McLuhan called it the global village. But anyway, it's sort of there throughout history. And, you know, not, you know, if it weren't for it, there would be no like procreation, right? But humans don't just go for it for the procreation, they go for it for the great joy and pleasure it brings. And so Six Yogas is very important because it teaches us how to utilize our inner energies in a very creative way and do so in every kind of situation, not just on our meditation cushion or in a monastery or in a mountain hermitage or something like that. So for instance, Tilopa, even though he had been a monk for many years, didn't achieve enlightenment. And so his guru gave him, insisted that he take a job as the kind of butler to a prostitute. In those days, they didn't use the word prostitute. It was more like a
Courtesan.
Yeah, courtesan is a good word. Courtesan is a good word. An upper class, five-star prostitute. Because he was still kind of hung up about sexuality, having become a monk at a young age and not ever really understood it. And his teacher didn't say he should make love to the prostitute. Just by being her butler for a few years, he would sort of come to understand. He may have, it's not clear in his biography, yes or no. He's not one of those kiss and tell kind of guys. But same with Naropa, he couldn't achieve enlightenment as a monk and then dreamed of Tilopa or had a vision, Dakini vision of a Tilopa, and went and met him. And Tilopa had him get married and practice in a kind of a married way. And I don't know if they had a formal church wedding with bridesmaids and champagne. It might have been a simple mountain affair. Both just saying, looking at each other and saying, should we? Should we? We should. We should. So Karmamudra was put in there because without understanding our sexual energies, we'll never understand or get to the deepest recesses of our soul or our spirit. We could say that, something like that. And then on top of that, the extra one added to make 10 dharmas is Mahamudra, based on karma. And Marpa used to say, without karma mudra, there's no Mahamudra. And the reason he said that is because 3 qualities from karma mudra control become very pronounced: bliss, radiance, and beyond thought, a shutting down of duality thinking, something like that. A sense of great harmony or integrity of being is the third one, you could say. And at the moment of sexual orgasm, those 3 take over and the whole world, our sense of being, transforms. I sometimes mention that I once saw a study on Western science neurological study of sexual orgasm. And at the moment of orgasm, the brain 99.9 shuts down. That it becomes totally a kind of a full body or full heart experience, transcending the conceptual thought process or the duality process, you could say. The universe just becomes a vast, formless infinity of radiance and joy, those 3 qualities. Now, if we read Mahamudra literature, it's often said these 3, bliss, radiance, and non-duality, are also the roots of samsara. Bliss causes rebirth in the realm of Rupa Dhatu. Radiance causes rebirth in the first 4 of Arupa Dhatu. No. Bliss causes rebirth in the realm of Kam Dhatu, realm of the 6 realms of sensuality: hells, ghosts, animals, humans, asuras, and devas. And then radiance in the realm of the Rupa Dhatu, the gods. The gods are the realm of form. And the beyond conceptuality in the Arupa Dhatu realm, the 4 Arupa Dhatu realms. So if we just take those 3 without connecting to Mahamudra, the emptiness aspect of Mahamudra, or the bodhicitta, conventional and ultimate bodhicittas, the love, compassion, and ultimate bodhicitta emptiness aspect, infinity aspect, then they've just become causes of kind of positive rebirth, or rebirth in samsara. But if we use that to penetrate by means of Mahamudra, the nature of what is bliss, what is radiance, what is beyond conceptuality, the integrity of the 3 dimensions of being, you could say, then they become causes of enlightenment of the 3 kayas, of Nirmanakaya, Sambhogakaya, and Dharmakaya. So we see that in numerous Mahamudra commentaries. So I think 6 Yogas of Naropa is a very easy way to practice the Tummo, and an easy way to sort of lean into Tantric yoga without too much complexity. Tilopa was very, very skillful in extracting skeletal elements of those 5 or 6 main tantras and organizing them in a systematic way for practice. Now, of course, there is a tradition that they often are practiced in retreat in Tibet, but in Tibet, people became monks when they were 5 or 6 years old, and until then they just walked around behind goats or yaks or picked up turnips in a turnip field. And when they joined, they had to learn to read and write and memorize and learn, So when they would usually do these retreats when they're late teens or early 20s, we Westerners are in a totally different kettle of fish from those guys. When we come into Buddhism, we've always already got 11 or 12 years of general schooling and 4 to 10 years of university training, and we're in our mid-20s with probably 15 to 17 years of institutionalized training and teaching and study. So the Tibetan model doesn't fit for us. It really doesn't. And the sooner Lamas realize that, the better off we will all be.
Wow.
They won't realize that for a while, because right now, you know, they're still in the refugee mode of,
Exactly.
if you do a 3-year retreat, you have to do it according to this sect or that sect. So then you know, done 3 or 4 years with that sect. So then you'll become loyal to that sect or dedicated to that sect pretty well for the rest of your life. And they kind of like that. And I mean, it has its virtues, and all power to them to go that way. But for me, no, it's not the way to go.
I also would have just like a quick question that is very important. I'm a sociologist and psychotherapist, and I'm also seeing as a Buddhist practitioner for quite a few years that for some practitioners in the West, meditation practice has become a tool of escaping the reality, you know, in the emotional challenges, practical challenges. And would you have anything to say about spiritual bypassing?
Well, yeah, like anything in the world, you know, it can be used as a way to insulate, isolate, or escape. But I think meditation has less of a chance of doing that than many other manners of escape. You know, people who, you know, go skydiving, or, you know, racing motorbikes, or, you know, speedboating, yachting, and fishing, hunting. You know, those are escapes from reality, and you get a thrill by shooting a polar bear or murdering a fish, or, you know, pulling the head off a crab or something. It's a kind of a way of escaping the humdrumness of life. The good thing about meditation is any kind of escapism side of it probably will have overall still a beneficial effect on the person's life. Is what is meditation really? It's spending quality time with yourself, isn't it? And so you're really sitting down with your own body, mind, emotions, and putting your awareness on a kind of a self-created world. And this is very important, given, especially for adult Westerners, where we've been institutionalized almost from birth. I mean, we are the most brainwashed civilizations probably in the history of the planet. You know, the amount of brainwashing, go into kindergarten and say, oh yes, this is good and that's not good, and do like this and do like that. And all through school, it's like, yeah, it's like this and like that. We're totally sort of brainwashed with a secular brainwashing. And then for the last 10 years, our education is largely career-driven. So then we're sort of given a whole kind of position on what life is all about and how to live it. And people often come out of university getting drafted into a job, recruited it's called, but it's really being drafted into the army of workers. And they never had a moment of quiet with themselves. So I think meditation in that way, it's quality time with oneself. And otherwise, if we just say, go to a mountain resort by ourselves, we're going to sit there by a pool looking at the clouds. So we're still externalizing, or watching TV, or, you know, doing some sport. We're still kind of escaping from coming into direct connection with the deeper aspects of our own soul, our own mind, our own spirit, our own, in Buddhism, we don't like the word soul so much. So our own santana, our own flow of body, speech, mind, energy flow. So when we meditate, I think, you know, often we say, it's said in Buddhism, it's important to have a decent teacher, because a teacher, qualified teacher, not sure about that word decent, what it refers to. I'm not sure if a descendant from a barbarian king of Connaught could be called decent. But anyway, we have such deep conditioning socially And psychologically, by the time we come out of college, we're really just pretty well little robots who have been shaped to fit the corporate world, either as a professional or as a mid-level, accountant or something, or as a worker. And we haven't really come to terms with the deeper meaning of life. So if we have a proper teacher, our meditation will be more directly towards our needs. That is to say, our teacher will suggest meditations. It's like the difference between reading a book, say, on psychotherapy or psychology, and actually having a qualified psychotherapist or psychologist. Lots of people I know have read many books on pop psychology, but they've never taken a single session for themselves. They just use it as a kind of a way of knowing the language and, and interacting in a kind of an educated way. But that hasn't ever been applied directly to problem solving their own lunatic tendencies.
Or even emotions, dealing with
Yeah,
emotions.
sure.
This is what I actually would mean by spiritual bypassing. Whenever the emotions, like escaping even the sensory pleasures by becoming a monk, sometimes I notice this tendency in a Buddhist practitioners, like I won't get in touch with these emotions. I won't be trying to transform it. Instead, I will try to pacify it through the meditation.
Right. Well, becoming monk or nun, there's sort of conditions for that. And then you have to have someone who's been a monk or nun for 10 or more years to do the ordination. And they have to think that you're up to the task and also you'll benefit from the task.
Yeah.
But, there'll always be people who slip through the ropes, through the net, so to speak, who aren't really that qualified. But I think, I find myself with Mahayana Buddhism in particular, Lamrim and Lojong style. People talk about a lot about love, compassion, universal love, compassion, unconditional love, compassion, and benefiting all beings and the such. And they bypass the quintessential instruction, which is achieve enlightenment in order to be able to do that. So they're walking around like the dummies they once were and still are, using that kind of language. It's like, I would like to be a brain surgeon. So yes, operate on the brains of all sentient beings, operate on the brains of all sentient. But meanwhile, they didn't bother going to medical school. They didn't do the training. And so I find in Mahayana Buddhism in particular, there's a lot of that. Bypassing the actual inner experience to join in with the comfortable rhetoric, the sweet rhetoric. I think that's one reason why Buddha didn't write anything, even though he was very well trained in Sanskrit and was very well educated as an Indian prince. He had all the best tutors. But he chose not to write because I think he wanted enlightenment to be a living tradition, an oral tradition. And I think Mahayana maintained that reasonably well in India. And then in Tibet, it was maintained reasonably well by emphasis on the Lama. Like if you don't receive a teaching from a Lama, the teaching is useless. We can have the most profound teaching of the Buddha written in a book, but if you receive it just by reading it without someone who read it and understood it and practiced it, you won't get the desired effect. So I think there is a problem in that regard, and people who just think, oh yeah, meditation, you just sit down, cross your legs and put your mind on your breath. And you have these kind of, 2-minute television ads for mindfulness meditation. Oh, it's very easy. Just sit down, cross your legs and put your mind on your breath and watch thoughts flow and let them go. Just release and let them go. Whereas, if you go to the Zen tradition, which does that very intensely, you have to do that in 3-month retreats under a qualified retreat leader. And, 24 hours a day. You sleep in the place. The only time you go out is to go to, you even eat in the zendo. You only go out to do your toiletry, to visit the garbage disposal units of the human waste. And so you get very precise attunement. But other people will read, you know, a couple of verses of Zen poetry and think, oh, that's very nice. And they'll see photos of people sitting like that. And they'll think, oh, yeah, I'll do that. And it easily just becomes another ego enterprise, doesn't it? I mean, because they're not using the method in the way of the living tradition. So all Tibetan schools say that without the oral tradition of something as a living tradition, it really has no spiritual power, only intellectual power. So like reading a book on psychology, you might get a few pointers, but you probably won't apply them to yourself in a very direct way or meaningful way. Those things you want to hide from and that you're scared to look at or admit in yourself, you'll still keep them well hidden. And you'll still be scared to open that box and look. And meditation does, as a casual enterprise, does have that. And of course, you know, monks or nuns, who knows? It's hard to say how, you know, what their own training is between them and their own teachers. So, you know, they are human like everyone else, and until they achieve deep realizations, will have their own limitations and their own faults and failings. As I like to say in the Irish tradition, except for you and me, nobody's perfect, and I'm not so sure about you. And it's true with all living beings like that. And even then, if we see imperfections in someone else, we can't really be sure it's actually an imperfection or if it's just kind of our own judgment. Like I often see people say things and I think, oh, what a rectum zapatur to say something like that. But that's just my opinion on such statements, isn't it?
Yeah.
Maybe that person is really very wise and he's talking wisely out of his rectum, giving deep words of wisdom.
So, wow, thank you so much for this journey through Tibetan Buddhism, how to dissolve dualistic awareness and sexual union, and applying it practically in daily life.
The other great thing about the Six Yogas of Naropa is right from the beginning, it hops to the integration of daytime practice with nighttime practice. In other words, how to, during the day, conduct a meditation session, between meditation sessions, integrate into ordinary life. If you're a bank manager, a taxi driver, a king or a jester, a court jester, how to integrate into your life. And when you go to sleep at night, how to do sleep dream yoga, and to access the beyond conceptual consciousness of the intuitive state of the dreams and how to enter that world in a yogic way. So it's one of the few systems, now all tantras have those aspects, but they don't present them in that structured a way. So for me, that's one of the very important aspects of sleep dream yoga.
Beautiful. So maybe to wrap it all up, would you like to say something about your current projects? What are you working on? What is the outlook for the next few weeks, months, years?
Well, because COVID sort of has hit the world so by storm and came in, I was sort of about halfway through my annual North American tour. I usually do 4.5, 5 months of 30, 40, 50 city tour around the States every year for the last 25, 30 years. Halfway through this, COVID sort of hit with a vengeance. So then the rest of them I did with Zoom. And then when they finished, the Zoom phenomena kind of just sort of kept going because the lockdown continued. And so 6, 7 times, sometimes 8 times a week, I teach by Zoom to groups around the world. Like just before talking to you, it was with a group in Moscow and The other day it was with a group in Berlin, and a group in Korea, a group in Scotland, and another group in Sweden, and another group in Detroit, and another group in California, like that. So probably between 6 and 8 to 9 sessions a week of teaching various things.
Are they your centers or the different Geluk centers, or?
They're just centers around the world who invite me to do things. And whenever anyone requests, I just think yes or no. And if I can fit it in, I'll try to do it. And at the same time, you know, I'm in a writing retreat. I received a grant to do a book on one of my favorite artists of the last century, Nicholas Roerich, Russian-born New York artist, who was the first Buddhist to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. He was nominated in 1929. And he died in 1947, lived the last 12 years of his life, not far from Dharamsala, where I spent all those years. Died there, and later, when he became something of a celebrity, his house was turned into a kind of a spiritual educational institute. And I don't know if you know him, but he became very famous. He's probably got, during his 1920s, he was perhaps one of the 10 most popular artists on the planet. 1930s, the Cold War, and then the World War II. And then after that, the Cold War, because he was Russian, sort of got him cut out of the circle of, and because he was kind of a spiritual person, I think that made people a little recalcitrant about him. So his popularity as artist went down, but he wrote about, I don't know, 20, 30 books on sort of spiritual issues. His art, I really like his art. His writings, for me, not that great, but anyway, good effort. At least give him a D for effort, right? And his wife was sort of a famous channeler of Blavatsky's deity. And later she channeled a couple of her own little deities and wrote hundreds of pages of sort of pronouncements. Kind of very interesting family. I wanted to do a book on his Buddhist side, because he was very big in St. Petersburg during the life of the Tsar, and just happened to be out of Russia when communism took over, so escaped that crackdown, and then went to Paris and London and went to America and became hailed as one of the great artists of his decade, you could say. But then ran into political problems, and America decided he was a spy for Stalin, and Stalin decided he was a spy for America, and the British decided he was a spy for the Russians, and the Chinese decided he was a spy for the Japanese. And so kind of an interesting sort of artist, philosopher, mystic, spy. I mean, he didn't think of himself as a spy. He just thought of himself as a walking encyclopedia. And he sort of was under this, he was a big Shambhala man, you know, the world's at the beginning, at the edge of coming into 1,000 years of golden light. And those of us who work hard will help bring in that 1,000 years. And so he saw the formation of the League of Nations and whatnot as sort of opening the door to that. And a billionaire in New York, gave him a 24-story building with the top 3 stories dedicated to art and world 1,000-year light stuff, and the other 21 stories for geniuses the world to come over and think how we open the doors to the 1,000 years of golden light. Until now, you know, every decision being made by people like the barbarian king of Connaught and the such. So that's why we've had such barbaric history, is because the geniuses haven't been the ones making the decision. It's been the cutthroat mobster thugs who take over political, secular, and financial power. The dummies have been running everything. So his basic idea was good. So I thought it'd be nice to do a book on the Buddhist face of Nicholas Roerich.
Amazing.
Beautiful.
that's kind of what I'm looking at. And, you know, the Rorik people won't like it very much because they don't think of him as a Buddhist. They think of him as kind of the greatest Messiah since goodness knows who. And artists like his art quite a bit. He's still quite popular with some art circles, but he's considered a little too spiritual for many, because art largely became a kind of a celebration of decorative pieces, something to hang on your wall to make your wall more interesting than just being flat, plain wall. So some artists find his art a little bit too message driven, you could say. He sort of has this enthusiasm for the hero who, you know, solves the world's problems and opens the door to the 1,000 years of golden light. And as a theosophist, he sort of sees the great traditions of the world as sort of being foundation stones of that. So there's paintings of Confucius and Christ and Muhammad and all this sort of stuff. Sort of what he thinks are pivotal moments in the history of the evolution towards 1,000 years of light.
Mm-hmm.
Then we have the setback of that dummy Biden winning the election.
We cannot disagree.
And Putin running Russia, and the evil dictator Xi running China. Minor setbacks. Yeah. Okay, guys, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Really, we are very much appreciating your time. I know that you were just spending some time in Russia before us. So
yeah.
I hope you will rest right now, and we are very appreciative that you took time to talk to us.
My joy, my pleasure, my honor, and chat again sometime. Bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye
Thank you
for
so
now.
much.
Thank
All
you
the
very
best.
much.